Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you particularly to Noemi and her colleagues for the invitation to be with you today. And so I've taken as my title the open imperative, and hopefully that is an imperative we all share. But I think it has to be still very much a matter for discussion. Just to sort of point out, my slides, the organizers already have them, and they're welcome to distribute them, so you don't have to copy down URLs. As you'll see, most of my talks these days are reading lists of other clever people who've greatly influenced my own approach to this topic. And I am drawing upon both my own experience as a researcher, although I'm now retired from Imperial, but had a long association as chair of DORA, although I've handed over the reins now to two very excellent co-chairs, and Giovanna, who I think is here. Where's Giovanna? Hi, Giovanna, who I've not met in person until just now. We'll be obviously talking a lot more about DORA tomorrow morning. And now I'm associated part-time with the Research on Research Institute. And of course here, I think we are talking about research, and so we are being really rather meta in our deliberations. So the older I get and the more of an old fart I become, the more I tend to waffle on. So I will try to keep to my 30 minutes. I'll probably overrun the 30 minutes slightly, but I'll still try to leave lots of time for questions. But just to sort of give you my theme so you kind of know where I'm going or where I hope to head at. My overall question really is open research the last holdout of scholarly idealism in a world beset by biases, social injustice, national populism, and the perverse incentives arising from a mindset, a culture that's very much fixated on competition and on competition by numbers? My answer to that is yes, or yes, but I think we need to be careful and deliberative about how we go about that and remain open, and open is the theme here, to good faith dialogue with all parties who might have good points to make, criticisms to offer with regard to the open research agenda. So I want to start with a definition of open, which I got from my online dictionary. And of course, it has the obvious meanings of allowing access and making things freely available or accessible, which clearly speaks to the whole idea of open access, which I think is the movement that's at the very foundation of the broader open research movement. But being open is actually, there are many more dimensions to it, which arise from this definition. It's about being vulnerable or subject to different pressures, but also about being frank and communicative, welcoming public discussion, criticism and inquiry. Still admitting of debate, which is very much aligned with that, accessible to new ideas, open to is about being receptive to, and that's not just to new ideas, but also to new and different people. So it's about inclusion as well. So all of those dimensions, I think, play into many of the debates and issues and discussions around what it means to have an open research policy. And I very much am aligned with Andrew's point about thinking about the broader context. It isn't just about open access to journals. It isn't just about data and software sharing. There are many other aspects to enacting an open research philosophy, which is ultimately, of course, designed or aims to improve the conduct and productivity of the whole research enterprise. So, little history. So the whole idea of openness is actually something that's very much in the DNA of the scholarly community. And here's a sort of nice quote. It's actually in a well-known 1942 paper by the sociologist of science Robert Merton, quoting J.D. Bernal, who's a bit of a countryman of mine and also a bit of a hero, an extremely colorful character, quoting then Réaumur, this French scholar from the 1730s. And so for a long time within Europe, certainly, there was an awful lot of secrecy around scholarship. And so people would cling on to their ideas. But that eventually was overturned. And Réaumur identifies, or Bernal identifies, a sort of moral compulsion for publishing one's researches. And it was related to other elements in the ethos the ethos of science. And there's a quote in French here, which I've already translated. Our first duty is to our country, says Réaumur, but we also have a duty to the rest of the world. Those who work to perfect the arts and sciences should even regard themselves as citizens of the world. Now, citizens of the world is a phrase that some conservative prime ministers use as a kind of insult, suggesting that they are therefore citizens of nowhere. And that already sort of leads us then to some of the political currents that have intensified, shall we say, in recent months and years around differences between, I think, a scientific outlook and what in some quarters obviously is a rather narrow political outlook, but one that we cannot ignore. But it's very much part of, I think, the scholarly philosophy is to be open. I think I'm also influenced by this the very interesting essay in Nature in 1999 by Michael Gibbons, talking about science's new social contract. And this largely predates most of the sort of open access and open research movement, but he does note, particularly here, that the post-war settlement between governments and the research community was that science was expected to produce reliable knowledge, provided merely that it then communicated it to society, and the society would then take that knowledge and do interesting and productive things with it, and new industries would arise. And he's recognizing that actually that web of interactions is much more intimate and needs actually to develop really rather more if that contract, that relationship is to be truly expressive of the values of that society. So the new contract must ensure that knowledge is socially robust, and to ensure that its production has to be transparent, and participative. And transparency and participation, of course, are both aspects of openness. So he was really talking about openness, even though he rarely mentions the word actually in that particular article. But I would strongly recommend that to you. So openness is a value, and I think when we are trying to sort of make the case for reform, because the whole process of open research is about reforming our practices around research, changing the way that we do things, hopefully for the better, and that's rooted in our values. And if you are buffeted by opposition, it's always important to try and come back to think about your values. Now, here's Michael Sandel, a Harvard philosopher, who's thinking about values. Now, this is him. He's wrote a really excellent book called The Tyranny of Merit. And of course, our expression of our fundamental values is often rubs up against the ways that we decide who is meritorious or not. And he was talking about what's become of the common good. And here he is, and this is the link is active in my slide, a talk he gave at the Royal Society for the Arts in 2018. And he's reflecting on, why did Britain vote for Brexit? Why did America vote for Trump? First time around, they've done it again, the swines, but, and identifying that actually that's an expression of people who feel that, society is not working for them. They feel disenfranchised by the current political settlement. And, those are voices that we do have to be alert to. And he sees that as arising from very much the marketization of society, kind of driven by the sort of Reaganomics of Reagan, but also Thatcher's approach to sort of seeing the market as a solution to all of society's ills and as the way to solve that. And that kind of, in that process, he thinks that we kind of lost sight of the common good. And he's arguing we need to begin to tell stories around appreciation and recognition for contributions to the common life and to collective well-being. Now, of course, he's talking about society writ large, but those same concerns, those same issues, those same values, I think, percolate within the scientific society of which we are all a part. And, but of course, the values that we have within academia are distorted by the way that we have come to reify certain numbers, famously the General Impact Factor, the university rankings or league tables, which have proliferated like a fungus over the last 10 or 20 years, and which do drive an awful lot of behavior at certain levels in the university. And so, Manchester is as prone to them as Imperial is, and one certainly comes up against people who do think these are important. But and numbers are not unimportant, but they always have to be contextualized. But we have reached a point where, we have evaluation based on journal metrics, and that reduces productivity because people they're not being open. They're holding on to their research in the chase for journal prestige. So they don't publish until they try and get into the highest journals. So they'll go through multiple rounds of submission, rejection, resubmission as they work their way down the hierarchy of journals. It gives us a positive bias in literature, which is not healthy. We need to see everything that's been tried, because in order to extract all the value, we need to be open about that. And of course, there are many negative effects of this hyper competition, and many of which, of course, will be familiar to you. It devalues other activities, and it focuses on the what, not the how or the who of the production of new knowledge in whatever domain. Incentivizes fraud, contributes to mental ill health. Now, of course, these problems have been well known for many years, and there are many different initiatives around the world that are trying to address them. And very often, some more explicitly than others, then links to the reform of assessment are actually linked to the open research movement, because actually assessment reform is actually about being more open and more expansive about the criteria that we're using to make those kinds of assessments, being more holistic, not just thinking about where did you publish and take that as a marker of success, but think how did you go about that? How well do you commit to training the junior members of your team as part of your research endeavors, and seeking more explicitly to recognize those elements. And that's implicit, I certainly think, in the DORA declaration, but perhaps most explicit in things like Plan S, which links a drive to open access to the need to challenge the status quo in research assessment. And the same is true, I think, for the evaluation of the Hong Kong principles, which is about thinking about openness and research integrity, and then actually from the UNESCO recommendations on open science, we again very much link the advancement of open science being very dependent on improvement and reform of our research assessment practices. So there is a very complex set of contexts here that we always have to be mindful of, and lots of discussions to be had, oh dear, about how we enact those policies. Now, there are, of course, there's lots of advocacy and many good arguments we can make about, it's slightly unnerving, about why it's important to take an approach to open research. I just highlight a few here. Obviously, preprints are open and rapidly communicated, and I'm a big fan of preprints. I know there are issues. People sort of worry about the fact that we are publishing research that hasn't been peer-reviewed, so there are questions of reliability and misuse. I think they're often overstated, and I quite like the subversive notion of a preprint, because it isn't attached to a journal brand, and so you, as the reader, have to make your assessment of whether or not you think it's interesting to you or worth reading beyond the abstract. And I think in itself, the sort of the rise of preprinting, which of course has been in some domains of physics for a very long time, but in many other domains is a relatively recent innovation. I think it has stimulated a more informed discussion actually about the true value of peer review, which I think we often oversell, particularly to the public. And why is it that we still want journals? And I think there are still good arguments to be made for having journals, but I think we do need to think about the cost to openness in those. Of course, open access, which is well established, it maximizes scrutiny because it makes research most, as widely available as possible. Same as preprints, and of course that then helps to ensure reliability. So it's an open practice that is trying to fulfill the promise of open research, which is about improving the quality of the research knowledge that is put out there in the world. There are, of course, issues around equitable access, and we can talk a little bit more about models. And then open science generally is better for changing the world. And we do have examples of that. In small measure, in a sense, the Zika crisis, I don't know if you remember, but around the time of the Olympics in Rio, there was concern about the rise of microencephaly in Latin America, a link between Zika virus infections and the abnormal development of the brain in unborn children. And in order to accelerate research, the Wellcome Trust brought publishers together and got them to agree to allow researchers to preprint and publish their work immediately on the internet so that the whole community could get together and work the problem. And they got the publishers to agree that they wouldn't penalize people then subsequently submitting their manuscripts to the journals because they had done that. And that just tells you that our normal practice of publishing scholarly research actually acts against the public interest in a very serious public health crisis. And of course, we saw that on an entirely global scale during COVID. And of course, there are many other global challenges where openness of the research is necessary to enhance the productivity of our endeavors. But it's not just about, preprinting and open access journals and sharing data. As I said at the beginning, there are many dimensions to thinking about open scholarship, and this is a slide I use many times, recognizing is when I was just sort of talks about DORA, it was always complicated because there are always so many interlinked issues, and this kind of helps me to make a little bit of sense of the fact that the movements of reform and the movements of reform, both around research assessment, which DORA was focused on, obviously, are actually interacting and intersecting with the drive for open scholarship, because open scholarship is thinking about, how do we make outputs open? How do we make data open? And of course, DORA is about thinking not just about the final peer-reviewed paper, but thinking about all outputs, assessing people on preprints, not just insisting that they have to submit peer-reviewed journals, assessing people on, different forms of output, do they share data, do they share code? And then also thinking about outputs such as, highly trained, responsible researchers. And then open scholarship, of course, is not just about, the finished product. It's about opening up the academy and thinking about these issues of inequality and inclusion, and thinking about who gets a say. And of course, ultimately, of course, we now think more broadly around open research, and aligning with Gibbons, we have to think about societal participation, not just receiving the products of research, but actually having a voice and helping in some instances to shape the research questions that get asked. And that's one of the values that comes also then from diversifying the academy, which is why work towards EDI, or DEI as it's known in the United States, remains very important, even if it doesn't find favor with the current administration. So that's, for that, nice simple Venn diagram is a very simplistic view. And, if you were to enact these transformations, and actually the sort of bringing together of these three strands of reform movement, I think, brings us naturally then to a focus on our research culture, on the people who work within the research ecosystem and who benefit from it, and who perhaps control it with our political masters, and then the values that we bring to that whole endeavor. And we do have to think about people and values in all of our endeavors around open research. But how do you actually go about enacting the change that we want to see? Clearly, there's lots of good stuff happening here at Manchester and at other universities, but as someone who's written Athena Swan and Race Equality Charter Action Plans, I'm very keen on, smart targets, but, what are the smart targets for research? And who's going to deliver them? So they usually have a smart target. You have to name the person responsible for the action and who's going to lead on that. But of course, when we're talking about research, nobody's in charge, okay? There's nobody necessarily leading. You will see advocates popping up here and there, but this is very much a community endeavor. It's a discursive endeavor, because that community has very a diverse range of views. There are, of course, practical things that we can do, and we've seen lots of interesting initiatives. I mean, Andrew mentioned here the promotional criteria now sort of think about open research, And that's emerging more generally, particularly with the adoption of things like the narrative CV format in assessment. And of course, one of the advantages of narrative CVs is that an institution or a funder or whoever can tailor that to their values and to their particular mission. And so if open research is something that's important to you, as it is at the Charité University of Berlin, which has been one of the pioneers in this field, then you put that into your narrative CV. And contributions to broader society, again, that is one of the dimensions of openness, which is in the template that was concocted by the Royal Society, which has now been adopted by UKRI, of course, for all UK-based funding. So there are lots of things, and funders do have, as we noted, and this is a working paper from Rory that I was involved in 2020, funders do have a very important role here, but one that's, if funders are maybe a bit too aggressive with their mandates, then we do see pushback. And I'll talk about the REF in a little moment. Other practical measures, of course, are the development of new models of open publishing and open peer review. I'm not going to go into these, but I'll just highlight, obviously, preprints are important. eLife has this new model, sort of publish, review, curate model, which I think is actually very promising, and it's one that actually has been adopted by a project within Rory called MetaROR, and this is now a new publishing platform for meta-science research, or research on research, which adopts exactly the same publishing principle. You publish the preprint, it gets openly reviewed, and then there's editorial comment, and so it's curated. The Open Library of Humanities, I think, again, shows that this isn't just STEM people kind of driving the initiative, is one of the sort of early examples within Europe anyway, of the so-called diamond model, where one can actually deliver high quality open access journals without a cost to the reader or to the author. And that's a model that I know that the progenitors of Plan S are trying to promote now within Europe. So other practical methods, well, should we harness the REF to do this? So I want to speak briefly about a little bit of work that I was involved in with James Wilson and Lizzie Gadd in 2022. This report, Harnessing the Metric Tide, the literature review of which was written by none other than Naomi Aware-Bon here on the front row. So she was very much part of the team, even if she wasn't at the very nice lunch that James hosted when we kind of kicked things off at it. And we sort of, this was looking at the Metric Tide reports 7 years on and looking at, in terms of research assessment, what's changed. Are there things that one would change in the recommendations of this report from 2015 that happened in the interim? And we ran a number of workshops with different stakeholders within the community, researchers, but also research managers, university leaders, librarians, across the piece. There was very much a demand for actions, not more words. And I mean, we did try to keep our report short, but there were still some more words. But then particularly a demand for assessment to incentivize positive changes in research culture more broadly, not just open research, but thinking about, as we are here over the next 2 days, thinking about various different dimensions of research culture around behavior, around inclusion, and that really was needed to be incentivized. And then we also did note the emergence of these critiques of excellence. So the demand for clearer criteria of assessments that see excellent processes as integral to excellent outputs. And that's based on, I just mentioned a couple of the papers here, this very good one, Excellence Are Us, from 2017, from Sam Moore and colleagues. They interrogated the idea of excellence as a concept and find that has no intrinsic meaning in academia, okay? People don't really say what they mean when they're talking about excellence. They talk about, well, it's the best. And, who can be against excellence, because then you're in favor of mediocrity. And that's not really what it's about, but it does make the point that the rhetoric of excellence, when it's combined with narratives of scarcity, and of course, anyone who's worked in UK academia over the last 20, 30, 40 years understands the narratives of scarcity, you end up with this hyper-competitive culture that arises from the performance of excellence, which is at odds with the qualities of good research, because our ability to review excellence when it's in grant applications, sometimes in the claims that are made in papers, sometimes in the reports that are written and submitted to the ref. That peer review cannot reliably judge future excellence, citations and impact. It struggles to identify fraud. It sustains the positive biases in literature. They're well known, inhibits replication studies, and suffers from many different types of bias. And so we do need to be careful when we are bandying about this word. And certainly at my former institution, Imperial, we talk about excellence an awful lot. And I do recommend them all this paper. This is a slightly different perspective on it from Marieke van der Brink and Yvonne Benschop. And this is a sort of a sociology study of scientists. And what, they asked them, they interviewed them and said, well, what do you mean by excellence? And most were not able to provide a clear description. They said, you recognize it when you see it, okay? When pushed, what does an excellent researcher look like? Well, they said someone who has an outstanding reputation. And we know from other research that superlative adjectives like outstanding are much more readily applied to men than to women. Someone who's a strong but facilitating manager, and men are often rewarded for being strong managers, and women are sometimes criticized for being too bossy. Someone who has an international network of high status contacts, which you can forge if you have the freedom to go and attend international conferences, and that's easier for people who don't have caring responsibilities than people who do, and I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions about how that divide splits up, or people who are willing to work in excess of full-time hours. So even within that idea of excellence, of course, are coded all of these biases. And if we're not explicit about trying to address these biases, then we will get ideas of excellence that perpetuate a sort of white male hegemony in our institutions. So we have to be much more proactive about thinking about and think more openly about how we define excellence. I'm definitely not against it. I'm not in favor of mediocrity. But I think challenging the idea of excellence is important. And so the recommendations that we came up with, and I'll just focus on one, was more weight and structure in the environment statements. And that also aligned very much with ideas coming from the International Advisory Group that was inputting into this process too. So as I'm sure some here are well aware, then there are now guidelines for the REF. Well, actually, it's not REF 2028 because actually the new structure is a bit more complicated. So they've given themselves an extra year to pilot some of the developments. But basically, the weighting on research outputs was dropped from 60 to 50% in order to allow the environment statement to be weighted at 25%. And that environment statement now, of course, is people, culture, and environment. And they're being much more explicit, much more intentional about thinking around the importance of research culture in underpinning excellent research. Now, the reactions to that were not universally positive. Nigel Thrift, Sir Nigel Thrift, who's former Vice-C of the University of Warwick, said that REF could mark the beginning of a long goodbye of notions of research excellence, which we so badly need to keep hold of. Ian Mansfield, who works for the Policy Exchange, which is a Merkelly funded right-wing think tank. This will be devastating for UK research excellence. Outstanding research is being slashed to just 50% from 60% of the total score, 25% for people and culture. So running the right EDI schemes is worth half as much as outstanding research. And that's a very jaundiced view of what the REF is about with this reform. I did write a response in the HEPI blog, but it's really about recognizing as UKRI has done, that assessment shapes culture and done badly impairs the capacity of the system to generate the highest quality outputs. But there is an important debate here. I mean, I think Thrift and Mansfield, they're sort of free marketeers, as it were. They want the white heat of competition, unfettered by regulation, seeing that that will be the most efficient way for the market in research excellence to produce the most excellent outputs. But they want it unfettered by regulation that is actually seeking to mitigate some of the unintended effects that one gets if you allow competition to be completely unchained and free to do what it will. The end justifies the mean is the type of philosophy that they appear to be advocating. Maybe if you push them on that, they say, oh, no, 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 I don't mean it quite like that. So regulation is important, I think, here. And what we're arguing here for is a type of regulation. But how much regulation is enough? That's the question that I think we all have to face here. And this is an interesting substack from Henry Farrell, Blitzscaling for Tyrants. So he's talking about Doge, okay? And you all know what Doge is by now, but it's about, trying to enhance the efficiency of government. This is a little, not quite tangential to our theme, but hopefully you'll see the point I'm trying to make. But Doge is hostile to regulation. Now, actually, they're hostile to the rule of law, never mind regulation. But it's about, moving fast and breaking things and sort of doing it and overwhelming the opposition. And it's about, the tech bros from Silicon Valley who have, through blitzscaling, sort of developed a technology, brought it to market, scaled up so rapidly the competition had no time to respond and therefore occupy a dominant position. Amazon, eBay, PayPal, that this is the modus operandi. Farrell's criticism is that businesses and governments are very different things, and businesses and the way that we as a community would like to govern and run science are very different things at all. And his warning to the people from Silicon Valley is to recognize how readily a generic hostility to regulation can morph into the desire to eliminate democratic accountability, which is what we're actually seeing play out now in the United States. But democratic accountability is another word, in a sense, for regulation, because it's about being accountable, being responsible for the way that you do things. And so there is a question for us about when we are looking to reform and change things, how fast do we want to move? So we are looking for the utopia that is a world where all research is open and every researcher is an open researcher. And there's a wonderful book here by Rutger Bregman called Utopia for Realists. So he has this view: governing by numbers is the last resort of a country that no longer knows what it wants. A country with no vision of utopia. If we want change, we need to be unrealistic, unreasonable, and impossible. Okay, that's a very trenchant view. And there is a question, is that sometimes how open access or open research advocates come across? They're focused on the utopian goal so much, they sell it as a sort of gold-plated truth that nobody could possibly object to. And if you're opposing it, you're definitely on the wrong side of history. And I think there are some, perhaps, within the open advocacy movement who are trenchant. And that's, for me, that's fine, because I think, a plurality of voices is good. And we do need that discussion. Philosophically, I'm much more aligned with Adam Gopnik's sense of, how we learn from utopias and how we think about liberalism as a perpetual program of reform. And the result isn't a utopia. And I think we have to keep our feet in the real world, but merely another society with its own unanticipated defects to correct. Perhaps, hopefully, we'll improve some things. Our society, we have got rid of slavery for the most part, for example, but there are still many other aspects that need fixing. And so I think we do have to be realistic and humble enough to recognize that, reform movements will make mistakes, and that we do have to remain open to discussion around that. And my sympathy with Gopnik's view is rooted very much in the ideas of Isaiah Berlin, whose biography I've read. I read a little bit of his primary work. I'm not selling myself here as a scholar of philosophy, but actually this struck me as a really important insight. So Berlin, he was analyzing the Enlightenment philosophers and the Enlightenment rationalism, and recognized human values cannot be securely derived from human nature, because values are historical relative to the cultures that engendered them. And we know, and we've seen, of course, throughout history, that our values change and evolve over time, and even across different domains and different cultures, our values may not be the same. And that as a result, all serious choices, political choice, but choices about how we do things, small p politically within science, involve loss, not merely trade-offs or compromises. Genuine sacrifice, so much liberty sacrificed for so much equality, justice sacrificed for the sake of mercy, and so on. And that loss is inevitable because values are in conflict and human reason, or not because values are in conflict, and because human reason is incorrigibly imperfect. Mine is certainly imperfect. Reason might clarify the facts, but choice itself is an act of will, an instinct, an emotion, and as such, a gamble made in the dark. And I think some of our advocacy, maybe some of my advocacy is about, well, it's worth taking a chance on it because let's hope that it improves things. But of course, one has to be open to monitoring and reviewing the outputs. So free society was a good society because it accepted that conflict. And that we have to be open to that conflict and ready for it. But hopefully, of course, it takes the form of robust, but intelligent and informed and constructive debate. But that can sometimes be difficult to realize in practice. There's one instance, and this is a question that is often asked, I think, by some of the people in the reform community. They talk about science being broken or being in a crisis. And this is one instance of that, a sort of polemical piece by Dan Sarowitz, which I would strongly recommend to you. And you can read the link here, but you can read it in the copy. Science isn't self-correcting, it's self-destructing, he writes in his 2016 essay. To save the enterprise, sciences must come out of the lab and into the real world. And he traces the problem to this bold-faced lie which rests on the political and cultural power of science. He felt that science was given too much free rein in the post-war settlement. Scientific progress, according to the lie, rests on the free play of intellects working on subjects of their own choice. I think we would like to protect that kind of academic freedom, shall we say. But he sees that, science has kind of gone wrong and ended up down in lots of blind alleys. His solution wasn't, well, we need more open research, but I'll leave you to read the essay in itself. A number of people responded to that essay. I was very upset by it when I first read it. And actually the last second and third time I read it, I was less upset by it because I could see that he was making some points. But my point in my response was, polemic is a great method for stirring debate, but a poor one for achieving resolution. And so it can raise the question, but it doesn't necessarily answer the question. And so we do need to be ready to engage in that kind of dialogue. Now, we have seen a much more intense version of Sarowitz's plaint, shall we, in, well, let's see, it's not even 3 weeks ago. So this executive order from the White House on gold standard science. And it's kind of weaponizing these critiques of, crises and openness, or the lack of openness that have emerged from some of the reform movements within science. Now, you'll notice this, over the past 5 years, confidence that scientists act in the best interest of the public has fallen significantly. It's interesting, he only talks about 5 years, so the Biden administration. Everything was fine under the first Trump administration, but just 5 years. But they now have sort of listed, these are the things we will only consider scientific evidence if it meets these criteria, one of which, being transparent or being more open. And Joe Coleman, whom I don't know, but is a kind of meta-science scholar, sort of immediately pointed out, this is the weaponization of open science, basically ripped from the Center for Open Science's website, and is sort of very trenchantly critical of the deployment of a crisis narrative in science, as a reproducibility issue, because scientists aren't being open enough, they're not sharing their data, and they're trying to, they're therefore getting away with sort of massaging or faking their results, and that this is a really deep-seated problem within science. I think he overstates the case, shall we? But this is the type of dialogue that one is seeing. And here's another Substack that I read, this one by Kevin Munger from a few days ago, Open Science and Its Enemies. And it's an analysis of interesting perspective on the executive order and some of the issues that have been stirred by its debate. And he sort of traces some of the problem to the way that open discourse has been enabled but also distorted by the rise of social media and Twitter, or X in particular. So on Twitter, scientists have had intense debates about the status of scientific research, often criticizing scientific practice. They might have shared their own findings, which is good that they're being open about their research, maybe spouted off about their private political opinions as well, which maybe, given the sort of more liberal, progressive, left-leaning makeup of the academia, means that they're kind of losing touch in some senses with the sort of center of gravity of public opinion. But he does acknowledge, a science reform movement begins with some obviously correct and valuable insights between how science mythologizes our practices and the way that it actually unfolds. And that, again, is speaking to some of the crisis narrative. He does recommend that you need to pay attention to three elements. There's too much public self-criticism. Well, how much is too much? It's hard to know. And certainly, I don't think he's advocating that we should shut down all criticism of the way that science is done. Science cannot be mandated. I'm not sure that I agree with that as one of the people who advocates or welcome the REF open access mandate, and who is obviously an advocate of the expansion of the environment STIP. And I think science can be mandated, but it has to be done through a process of consultation with the wider community. This last point, yeah, it can't be mandated if the mandate is unfunded, and that's obviously deeply problematic. But so I think, we do need open discussion about problems within science, but I think this is sensible advice from Kathleen Hall Jameson from 2017, I think, but sort of analyzing the use of this crisis narrative, which I think we've seen a lot of, particularly in some fields, psychology for one, for example, where there have been sort of notable cases, but then also, which have sort of, and people use the sort of the crisis language to add urgency to their case for change, their case for reform. But she's pointing out that, defective narratives about problems, they can enhance the capacity of partisans to discredit areas of science, genetic engineering, vaccination, climate change, containing findings that are ideological and congenial to them. And you've seen that happen exactly in that executive order, which is an entirely bad faith representation of a good faith effort within the scientific community to open up its practices for scrutiny. Her recommendation really is that, news accounts or scientists who talk to the press around the criticisms should really point out that scholars are not simply criticizing practices, but are actually also, as critics, working hard, as we've seen, particularly in the psychology community, the advent of registered reports, et cetera, to apply correctives. And so it's about making sure that the context is always important. I will leave you with just this whole story and trajectory of my own has brought me to the doors of the Research on Research Institute, where obviously many of these issues are matters for ongoing research projects. We are hosting the Metascience 2025 conference, which starts at the end of this month. I'm afraid it's now over full. There will be 770 people coming to the conference. We were aiming for 650, but there are, if you go on the website, actually there are 10 pre-conference symposia, which are all online and which have unlimited capacity. And so if you haven't already registered, then there will be some very stimulating sessions in the 2 weeks before the conference. They actually start on June 16th, in a week's time. Oh my God. Okay. Right, so final thought from, again, you can see that I subscribe to the New Yorker, but I'm a big fan of Atul Gawande. This is a wonderful article about how you change people's minds, okay, about things. We yearn for frictionless technological solutions, but people talking to people is still how the world's standards change. And if we are going to make an open research world, then we are going to still have to talk to people and address their concerns and hopefully offer them some solutions and some hope. So with that, I will shut up and thank you very much for your attention. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for an excellent keynote. We've got time for 2 questions.
I'm around for all of the rest of today if anyone wants to buttonhole me afterwards.
Thanks for the offer. Any questions? Yes, please. Have we got rolling mics in here somewhere? Yeah.
Thank you. I enjoyed the talk. I'm Yo Yehudi from OLS. So at one point you talked about ways that research assessment is changing, perhaps for the good, and you included things like resume for researchers and narrative CVs. Now, my personal experience with those is that funders and research assessors stand smiling, looking and saying how good we are that we've made this new assessment. And people who've actually had to write them are like, oh my God, I now have 30 more pages that I have to write, as well as everything I had to do before. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about this, the difficult side effects of research reform that is really well intended.
Thank you for the question. I mean, you make a very good point, and the point is not to make life even more difficult for researchers like yourself. I would point out that people often already had to write cover letters or to write a sort of history of my research career so far in grant applications anyway. So there was already that requirement. Hopefully you're not writing narrative CVs that are 30 pages long, because the whole idea of them is that they should be concise. I mean, to my mind, it's one of the answers to the question of, well, if I'm not allowed to look at impact factors, what am I going to do? Am I supposed to read every paper that this person has published? No, you're not. You get them to write a short description where they say, this is my most important work, and this is why it's important. And hopefully they won't say it's important because it was published in Nature, okay? Refunders, well, hopefully they're not sort of sitting back and saying, oh, look what we did. We introduced narrative CVs, aren't we great? I know that many of them are currently reviewing the way that they have landed, both with researchers, but then also with reviewers and panelists who are assessing them. Rory has just done a project called Narratives, which will be reporting, I think, just at the conference, actually, on their findings. And that was work done analyzing actually how reviewers change the way that they do the assessment and what they've learned. And I know that in Ireland, the SFI, as was, and the FNR, which is the Luxembourg National Funder, and the SNSF, the Swiss, have also already, they've introduced this format, but they are reviewing, and hopefully they are working with their communities to say, okay, did this work for you? You know, what's wrong with it? Because we have to beware, as Gottmik would say, of the unintended consequences. You know, hopefully the world is slightly better. The transitions are always a bit painful, certainly, particularly for those at the forefront, as you seem to be, unfortunately. But I hope they are open to, you know, the lessons that you may have to tell them about how to do it better. But I do still believe that, you know, if someone can demonstrate the capacity to sort of think about why is their work important, that's a really important skill that we ought to value, and that there's much more value to that than just a list of publications, which most reviewers won't read.
And thank you for the question, Yo, and thanks for the answer, Stephen. We've got time for one other question. Yes, Andrew, I'll just hand you my mic.
Thank you for that lovely talk, and it sort of revived my enthusiasm, because I think some of those criticisms you mentioned can hit home. I was wondering if you could talk about one aspect of sort of tension. You mentioned right at the very beginning, sort of geopolitics, countries, you know, hundreds of years ago wanting to keep their scientific secrets to themselves, and the researchers wanting to kind of share that. It feels a little bit like we're going back to that with terms like trusted research, in terms of you can share this research, but not with these people. But also that imperative is coming from the people who are paying for the research. So I just wondered if you could speak to, particularly from government funding agencies, I wonder if you could maybe speak to that tension of where research is open, but maybe not as open as we would like, but is that just the world we live in?
Yes, so I think obviously now there is more regulation around research that has dual use, and so it might be used for nefarious processes. And I know that at Imperial, a number of research programs have had to be stopped because they discovered that it was with Chinese groups who had strong links to the military. And the UK government is certainly much more on top of universities thinking about that. You know, those are legitimate real world concerns. One doesn't want to give succor to the enemy, as it were, although I hope we're not at war with China, but that's the kind of geopolitics of what we need to work with. And within that, of course, there is obviously still value in opening up research, and I think within China as well, there is there's much more a much more positive attitude now to open research. They want to be seen as big players on the international stage. Now that the US looks like it's leaving the international stage, I think you can see the Chinese already moving in. They've already made a big donation to WHO now that the states are no longer funding it. And I think scientifically as well, they will see opportunities. But of course, Chinese interests are not aligned with European interests necessarily, even though we do an awful lot of trade. And I personally have had collaborations with Chinese researchers, and they've been very productive, but clearly there's different culture and a different politics operating there, and we can't escape that, and we can't pretend that we can escape it. So, but we can still, I think, cling to the value of open scholarship. And I do think this, this idea of a society, a republic of letters, which is the way that it was put in maybe by Alexander von Humboldt or someone like that. Maybe I'm a romantic, old romantic myself, but that whole idea of that perspective, that positioning, that I do science in the service of humanity. I don't necessarily do it in the service of the UK, even though I will tell the BBSRC that this will lead to the invention of a new vaccine for foot and mouth or whatever, just done in the past. So yeah, there's a bit of strategizing has to go on.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Stephen. Stephen will be around.